oh, well, if I suffer now, I might gain something in the future, but there's no guarantee
Right.
of that gain in the future. That's
so you think
no
hard
guarantee of
work
that.
is definitionally morally bad?
When did I say that? I don't think hard work is always harm. I think some people work hard and they like it, so they're
Right,
not being
but-
harmed. They're not suffering.
Right, but-
they like their hard
so-
work. I believe
so-
suffering
so
hard
now
work
we're-
is probably bad.
So now we're not talking about physical pain, right? Physical pain is not a meaningful metric. What you're talking
Well,
about
I
is
said pain and
happiness.
suffering. I said pain and suffering. I think suffering
People suffer.
can be
people,
emotionally or physically.
if you ask any gym bro, like they'll say they suffered for the body that they prefer, right? That they went through pain and suffering, and they did so on purpose to get a morally desired outcome, right?
Yeah, that was
so I don't understand what you're grounding this in.
That was consensual. They did that themselves.
So you can't be harmed by things that you consent to? Have you ever heard of BDSM?
No,
Oh,
all right.
man.
Now I have a feeling we're gonna agree on our basic premises, but I have a feeling we're gonna disagree on reasons. That's my guess. Of how this is gonna go.
So I was DM'd by, like, I don't remember. It was a couple people in my audience were like, hey, this guy is a lefty. He's like, has like an open call in to do debates. You should like hit him up right now. And I was like, dude, I have like scheduled content. This shit is like, I'm not like I'm not a one viewer Andy, right? Like
Yeah.
I actually like shit's scheduled out. Let me DM him and see if we can do something. And I saw that he had like an open call in basically on like 3 issues. And I was like, okay, I get the feeling that a majority of these conversations are with trolls and chuds, right? And
Usually.
And so I looked at it and I was like, I would love to be able to have these, because I think what ends up happening is, from the conservative perspective, is conservatives are what I like to call family value consequentialists, right? Philosophically, they're just fucking lefties, just with different values. And I was like, no, I feel like you guys disagree at the description of the issue and can't ever get to the prescription or the prescriptive, right? And I think that we will likely agree on a lot of the descriptive issues, the issues with policing, etc., which is the topic. We didn't want to do abortion. But that we will be wildly different in how we reach that conclusion from a philosophical standpoint, as well as what our prescriptions are. And so that's why I wanted to have this conversation, as I was like, or this debate. Because yeah, I don't actually know your position fully. I have an opening statement for whenever you want to introduce yourself to whoever I've got on Rumble and vice versa and get into it. I wrote an opening statement, and then maybe we can, and I'm sure you have like an opening or like a thing you normally say. But I think that this will be different from previous conversations, so it should be fun.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I'm Jovan. My name is JovanBradley. I use my full government online because I don't hide who I am and what I stand by. I'm a leftist, clearly. I do think that when we look at some of the intersections of leftism and libertarian, a lot of the things are the same. Both of us kind of want to, in my understanding of talking to leftists, we all are libertarians, sorry. We both kind of want a stateless society. We just might have different ideals of what that stateless society might be. If we're having our conversation on police and prisons, which is, what we had talked about, I believe that that police and prisons are part of a carceral state that exists to oppress poor people and people of color, specifically to generate slave labor and capital for the state. I believe in the abolition of police and prisons in favor of transformative and restorative versions of justice. So that's where I come from. We're live right now to 200 of my Twitch viewers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to also introduce yourself, I'll gladly listen to your opening statement and everything as well.
Yeah, so I'm Scott from Fabian Liberty. Up until a couple of days ago, really, we were predominantly Twitch streamers. We're trying Rumble out just to see if Rumble is a better place for us, because there's just so much censorship and issues on Twitch. But you can give me a follow on Twitch as well. I don't think we're wholly abandoning Twitch. It's still a great viewing experience. And yeah, so I've done a lot of these. I am an anarcho-capitalist, right? I I'm the last boss of libertarianism in the American Rothbardian tradition, though I would say I'm probably more Hoppian. But nevertheless, at least in the sense of favoring argumentation ethics is like kind of the standard for things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I'll go ahead and give my opening statement because I think it fleshes out for the most part what I believe here. Because I didn't know how you do these debates. Most of the debates I'm used to, it's like both parties give a 5-minute opening statement. So I guess I'll read this and then I'll give you like a large portion of time to respond. That way it's somewhat fair.
Yeah, I tend to do more informal, so I'm fine with whatever.
Okay, so both my opponent and I wish to destroy the current system of policing and prisons. One of the often misquoted warnings of President Eisenhower's farewell address includes the term prison military-industrial complex, not the military-industrial complex. The war on drugs, over-policing communities, possible misrepresentation of officers versus the communities they serve, police lacking a constitutional duty to protect, Pearson v. Ray, 1967, etc., are all valid concerns of the institution of policing and, by their effect, prisons. The issue at hand, then, is not a discussion of whether our current system is bad, but instead on where these conclusions derive and what the philosophical basis for this contention demands as a replacement. The current policing system is atrocious for one reason and one reason alone. The state has a monopoly on both policing and prison. This is ethically unjustifiable. Policing and prisons are not unjustifiable and, in fact, necessary. Police, whether they are community police, private security, or a state monopoly, are the answer to the question, or else what? There is no utopic future in which criminals stop existing and are never born. When voluntary interactions are superseded by those who would use force to gain what they want, there must be some enforcement mechanism in place to deal with said people. To think that humans will transcend crime forever is quite fantastic and not grounded in reality. Humans are rational actors that behave according to their goals and the best means to achieve them. Often we act with inaccuracies or biases that ultimately go against our own self-interest. But these information failures do not change our status as rational actors. Some people will always decide that aggression is in their self-interest, and when they refuse to submit to the will of the aggressed or community, they must be dealt with in some capacity. Enter police and prisons. Now, opponent has one advantage. Prisons are indeed unnecessary. We can simply kill all criminals. Though I wouldn't suggest this to maintain a stable, healthy society. What is justified against any aggressor is equal force to the crime they have committed until they recant and pay restitution and retribution. Criminals are unable to argue for their bodily autonomy until they do so. Prisons are a necessary component to house criminals as both a form of restitution retribution and to maintain the safety of a society. These institutions should be fully privatized and competing to offer the best services. Voluntary prisons ensure that criminals are treated in the most efficacious way possible, as opposed to the state that makes decrees in the interest of the state and houses the prison population via taxes stolen from its citizens. As for police, I'm not opposed to community policing. A wonderful example of this in practice is Tehran, Mexico. A population of 11,000 to 18,000 residents have drastically reduced crime and effectively policed their forests from illegal loggers, cartels in the Mexican state. Further, police often escort young miscreants as a means of giving them power within the community, alongside counseling presided over community elders, and has led to reduced crime. This, however, still requires a dedicated police force to establish order within the community and protect it from invaders. Police must always exist. If this is the case, what are you proposing they be replaced with, and why? If your analysis of the failure of the state is from a subjective, consequential analysis, then you are left with no argument to abolish the police. Firstly, the weak foundation of your subjective analysis offers little more than your opinion. Secondly, you have the burden of proof, even from your own framework, that your replacing of the institution will be more effective in the unsure future. The only strong argument against the current policing system is on a deontological or natural law position, specifically that the monopoly of the state on these institutions is a violation of our rights to protect property and persons. You must affirm the right of voluntary systems of security, private firms for policing, and the justified action of housing criminals in private prisons. To do anything else is histrionics based on poor philosophy. So like I said, you didn't have a prepared statement, so I just want to just give you a good time to go through some of the points, and then we'll go into a back and forth. But I want to try and not interrupt you, because I'm sure that's a lot to hit you with.
Yeah, for sure. And I tried to write down, your basic points so that I would have them have them to pull them up. So let me just pull this back up. So right off the bat, some of the things that I disagree with is the need for privatized prisons and privatized police forces. I do believe that specifically when it comes to prison, a privatized prison system would lead to, as we've seen in our current system, a lot more, I want to phrase this, it would lead to a lot more human rights violations, specifically when we look at companies like Securus, companies like I don't know the names of them, but the companies that like provide the food in prison. And I think that will lead to like more slavery. One of the biggest issues that I have with prisons is that they are a legalized form of slavery. I don't think anybody should be forced to work for profit. For no profit. I don't care what you've done. And I don't believe that slavery should be punishment for a crime. You said that policing in prisons give the state a monopoly on police in prisons. I would say it gives the state a monopoly on violence. That's my more issue with it. Not that it gives them a monopoly on police in prisons, because I would say the same thing.
We agree there. Yeah. We agree there. Yeah. It's just, I was just contextualizing it within the specific conversation. I agree with you there.
For sure. You said police in prisons are necessary. I do disagree in their current form. I think, in my opinion, I would want to replace prisons with either long-term rehabilitation centers or long-term care centers. That's how I would restructure the justice system. I actually want to focus more on mental health rehabilitation, mental health care, than I do the prison system in its current shape and form. I don't believe we need police as we know them as well. I actually think police engage in multiple human and constitutional rights violations in the current form, and I think any version of police, whether they be state sanctioned or not, would engage in the same thing. What I'd be more interested in is the possibility of a governmental agency that is focused more on public safety. We can still have a subsection that is focused on a reaction to violent crime, but I would only allow them to be a reactionary force. I wouldn't allow them to engage in policing. I wouldn't allow them to engage in with the general public unless they are specifically reacting to a violent call. I believe that the bulk of crime that we have in this country is bred from poverty, and the lower amounts of crimes that are these crimes of passion or these violent crimes, we can talk about how to lower those and what we should do with those. But I believe if we address the poverty issue in the country, we would see a decrease in a lot of these other crimes, specifically like drug crimes, theft, crimes like that. So yeah, I don't believe that these should be fully privatized. I think that's going to lead to more instances of corruption and more instances of like exploitation of the prison worker.
Okay, so going by a few points, I think maybe I hit you with too much with the opening statement, and like the wall of text that it is, because there's some misconceptions about what I stated here. So, sure. You know, when I said I'm fine with community policing from Tehran, Mexico, that should have been like an indicator or something, right? And what that is an indicator of is that I am not saying we need privatized prisons. I'm not saying we need privatized policing agencies under rights enforcement agencies. What I'm saying is that this is a natural law right of individuals, that I'm not saying that that is my prescription. My prescription is whatever it is that a community or a covenant community or a set of individuals choose voluntarily for themselves as a means of establishing order, right? If you choose to live in, let's say, a community like Tehran, right, where the policing system looks radically different from our own, that is perfectly reasonable and perfectly fine. Now, I think Tehran probably benefits from the fact that they can banish individuals, right? And then the kind of the policing prison system is then kind of held by, becomes all of a sudden becomes a duty of the Mexican state. And the Mexican state has so many issues that they don't really have they don't have like if they didn't have so many cartels and other issues and things of that nature, they likely would have something to say to Tehran about that. But Tehran's not really exporting a lot of violent criminals. And I think it's an interesting case study in exactly how good policing can look separate from what we have. And it is indeed goes towards your issue that from a consequentialist perspective, you believe, right? And it is not an unreasonable belief, right? That a reduction in poverty would lead to a reduction in crime. These two are highly correlated, right? Now, to be more fair, it appears that it's actually wealth disparity, not necessarily poverty itself, right? Because in impoverished nations, poverty doesn't seem to have that strong of a correlation of crime, but in first world nations, it does. And so it appears to be that there, and we don't really know, but it looks more like there's another factor, or cofactor, I should say, or confounding variable, which appears to be those in poverty that see inequality on a daily basis, right? Those that live in poverty but see wealthy people, or they drive to work and, you know, and they're serving food to wealthy people. The lack of the feeling of fairness per se. But I think that that's being nitpicky with the data. I get what you're saying, right? That if we tackled poverty, that would be another thing. But again, over and over again, you keep saying that I'm saying that these are that privatized prisons or police are necessary, or that they must be the way that we do it. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you're not justified in using force to stop those things.
Well, okay. So that's, I guess my confusion was that I wrote down specifically when you said police must always exist and prisons are necessary for safety and that they should be fully privatized.
Some form of policing must always exist. Now that's why I bring up Tehran to say what that form looks like doesn't necessarily have to be our current system. But like, somebody needs to wield the gun that says, you know, when the criminal says, you know, or else what? Someone needs to say, or else I'm going to beat you up and put you in jail, or else I'm going to beat you up, or else I'm going to shoot you, or else I'm going to stop you by some violent means if you don't stop enacting violence upon other people.
So why do you feel prisons must be, police and prison, or not must be, why do you feel like there should be a privatized model of these things?
So I don't know per se that there should be, right? Again, I'm not making a moral claim that prisons should exist per se. I don't see any other efficacious way to house criminals other than locking them away if they don't have the means to recant and pay retribution and redistribute, retribution and some form of restoration, right? I don't see a current solution other than that. That doesn't mean that a community couldn't ascertain one where it becomes obsolete. It seems far-fetched to me that you will not have a society where some people lack the means to be able to pay restitution for the crimes that they commit. That there isn't some portion of the population that doesn't always have enough property on hand to pay damages for the crimes that they commit, right? It just seems utopic.
So I'm more interested in, you said that we can't get rid of the private sector of this, right? So like, why do you believe that we can't remove the private sector when it comes to police and prison?
Again, I don't think you can't, right? What I'm saying is that you don't get to use violence to stop it from occurring. Like if I own property, right, and I want to protect my property with private security, you're not justified in saying that this is somehow a form of enslavement or somehow wrong for me to protect my property with private security. And that private security must, right, in order to be effective, unless there's some magic happy gun, right, be able to use force to forcibly remove people that I do not want on my property, or to engage with criminals that in some way, shape, or form damage or attack my property, right?
Okay, could you, okay, so that I'm understanding, because I feel like either I'm mishearing or something's happening. Do you believe that a privatized prison system is beneficial, or do you believe that we just haven't found a better solution to prisons currently, but there might be a better solution out there?
I would say, it depends on what you mean. Like, you'd have to define your parameters for beneficial. To what end, right? Do prisons take criminals off of, does it house criminals, right? If the goal is, how do we house criminals that don't pay restitution, right? Prison is an adequate means of doing so. Yes. If that's your goal, is simply to house. If your goal is an overall reduction in crime, right? I would say that especially our current system does a fairly bad job of that. But when you're comparing it to the non-existence of prisons, right? I don't see a society, a historical example, or any data that suggests that there is a better, more efficacious way of not having prisons in the regard of reducing crime. But I think there's plenty of evidence to show that there are better prison systems, right? Where people are not locked up for nonviolent crimes, where communities are not over-policed for regardless shit, where people are not thrown in jail for failure to appear court because they don't have enough money to pay for the traffic ticket, because they don't have enough money to pay their insurance. Because, you know what I mean? Like there are certainly issues.
Yeah, I guess my confusion then is what we're specifically debating on. I feel like we mostly agree. When I feel like it might burn down to a semantics issue, which I don't know if we want to have a long debate over semantic stuff. When I look at police and prisons, when I'm saying like abolish police, I view policing in America as a very specific thing. Same with prison, and I feel that those two phrases have taken on different meanings in this country compared to what they mean in other countries. So, like for instance, prisons in America, I believe, are a wholly separate thing from prisons in Norway. And if we remove the slavery and forced labor aspect and the human rights violations outside of our prison system, it's now almost something completely different. And so when I'm saying abolish prisons,
there's a massive point of contention there, right? Like, there's no such thing as enslavement of a criminal. It's not possible. You cannot enslave a criminal. Well, criminals don't have a right to bodily autonomy. They don't have human rights.
I would disagree with that as well.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. There's a great point of contention. Where are you basing human rights from? Where you allow criminals that have aggressed upon others and have not recanted and paid redistribution and restitution? Where are you basing those rights from that you say it becomes an aspect of slavery and human rights violations?
Yeah, so I believe all humans have human rights, like inherent human rights, such as the right to life, and I believe that we have a reasonable right to bodily autonomy. Now, when we commit a crime, I believe that we can lose some of our right to bodily autonomy, but it has to be reasonable. I think locking somebody away and separating them from society is reasonable, and I view putting them in solitary.
Who defines reasonable?
Labor. We would define reasonable for the terms of this debate. It would just be based on what we consider.
Well, no. I mean, like, in general, if reasonable is the metric by which you determine whether or not an individual has certain rights to bodily autonomy, what does reasonable mean? Is this a subjective analysis of the community, of an individual, of a judge? Like, where are you getting this cockamamie idea? Reasonable seems like a code.
We as a society would have to come to a consensus. It's the same way we do it legally, right? Like when we look at like legality, there are certain laws where like the criteria for the law is like police, for instance. When a police responds with force, it's literally coded in the law that they have to respond with a reasonable amount of force. So we have this common understanding of reasonable, and we can talk about that here, but I think we as a society like have a common understanding of reasonable, and it's just talking about like what we would consider reasonable and what we wouldn't consider reasonable.
Obviously we don't, right? If we did, there wouldn't be disagreement, right? There wouldn't be disagreement between some individuals that live within this society that have presumably signed on to this non-existent social contract, right? That believe that certain treatment of criminals is fair, and you believe that it's a human rights violation in a form of slavery, right? So I'm highlighting that there is disagreement upon what reasonable means, and the evidence that you present on the idea of reasonable as a means to call it slavery is, well, we as a society collectively kind of understand it. That's not a definition. That's a communal subjective analysis that we kind of just play with. At that point,
sure.
The problem with that is that those in power can use the term reasonable, right, to stretch whatever benefits them, which is what's currently occurring.
Sure, but we can look into this even further, right? So you're saying that it is okay to force prisoners to work to pay off restitution. What happens if the prisoner is innocent?
You make that gamble, right? Because there is an objective fact, right? So when you say the person, what happens if the person is innocent? Well, you just changed the scenario, right? Because there's a matter of fact, right? There's a historical fact. Let's say it's murder, right? person A murders person B. That is a fact. There's somewhere in the world that occurred, right? Now, what we do as an observer is we attempt to ascertain the truth, right? But we don't always get it right. We don't always know, right? Depending upon how strict our legal system is, sometimes we let murderers go free. Sometimes we convict innocent people, right? But we're doing our best to ascertain that fact. And then we take a gamble based off of our ability to ascertain the truthfulness of a thing, right? So for example, let's say we lock someone up. It was, and they were innocent. It was always ethically unjustifiable for us to force that person to work. That is the case. But we take a gamble based off of our ability to ascertain the truth that we believe, to the best of our knowledge, that that person is a murderer, and we do what we do to them. Once it has been proven, let's say, I don't know, like, there's so many of these organizations, for whatever reason, I can't think of the big one off the top of my head that uses DNA evidence to overturn convictions, usually of black people, that have been like wrongly convicted in like the racist South in like the 60s and shit. You know which one I'm talking about?
There's a few of them, so I don't know which one specifically.
Yeah. Nevertheless, let's say one of them, it's not the specifics is not necessary, right? Let's say they present DNA evidence and they prove that this person is innocent, right? So our understanding of the historical record has now changed, right? It is not the individual that was forced to work against their will, right? That was the aggressor. It was the state in this instance, right? But a non-state entity in, the kind of like in our fully privatized, voluntaristic society model, right? That is the actual aggressor. Kidnapped someone, forced them to work against their will, et cetera, et cetera. And it is that person that we now understand is the criminal that can be forced to pay restitution and repayment to that person. So let's say they were in prison for 5 years, right? They had a rights enforcement agency, insurance, there's some form of arbitration to determine exactly how much money is owed, which is likely what is 5 years of a human's life worth. That's for arbitration to, in that scenario, or the covenant community, et cetera, to determine, and then double that is paid to the individual.
Yeah, so I guess a difference here would be that I view one of those instances as too much. If that happens one time, I view that as one time too many. I think that there is a system where we can separate people from society and not force them into this system of slavery, thus limiting the chance of somebody being violated in that way. I look at instances like Khalif Browder, who killed himself after spending multiple years in Rikers for a crime he didn't commit. And just because he was exonerated didn't mean that it didn't traumatize him completely, didn't make it impossible for him to live a normal life, and then he took his own life. I mean, we can see that in just solitary cases, and how much solitary confinement can absolutely destroy a person's psyche.
All over a backpack.
All over a backpack. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that it's a gamble that I'm worth gambling, that I'm willing to gamble.
Okay, so your original point of contention, right, was that it is definitionally slavery and human rights violations to do to anyone. And we have this new point, which is that the difference is one time is too many. So which opinion do you hold? Because the two opinions conflict.
How do they conflict?
Okay, so you're saying this is your problem with my announcement, with my argument, and my argument is against the former, not necessarily the latter. So that's where they conflict. So you don't disagree with my assessment, and you would be forced to say, if your only disagreement is one time is too many, that's a moral preference about your prescription of the society you want to live in, not necessarily an argument against whether or not it is justifiable to enslave someone that factually committed a crime and thus are incapable of arguing for their own bodily autonomy.
Wait, I disagree there. I asked you how we account for innocent people to be people who are innocent to go through this. I would argue, even if you're definitionally not considering it slavery, the minute they're innocent, I would say that they absolutely definitionally is
yes,
slavery.
I agree. Only so to the innocents.
But you said that that's a gamble, and I said it's a gamble I'm not willing to take because one time too many is too many for me. So I don't know how those two things conflict.
Right. So what you're saying is if there is no cognitive dissonance in the statements that you're making, then what you are saying, right, that if we assume no cognitive dissonance, is that you believe that it's not slavery to enslave, quote unquote, right? To take someone who has committed a crime and force them to work against their desires, against their wishes, against their goals until restitution and repayment is done. You're saying it is only slavery as a broad scope because we recognize that at least one of these individuals is likely innocent. And I am okay
I believe
with
it's
that.
both slavery. I was arguing under your framework of how it's slavery to you. So I was asking you about your framework.
So
I believe it's both slavery constitutionally.
Okay, well you can't right. So that's why I'm saying which position you hold. So you still hold the position that a criminal that like murders someone, let's say grand theft larceny, right? They steal $20,000 worth of something. I come and capture them as a private security firm, and I make them work to pay off $20,000. And once they do, I let them go. You're saying still that even if we know for a fact, we have a magic machine, right, that knows 100% for a fact that that individual did that crime, that it is still a form of slavery. You're saying that, okay?
Yes,
or are you saying that isn't slavery?
I would say if you force someone to work without paying them, that's slavery.
Okay, so slavery now is forcing someone to work without paying them. If that is the definition,
I believe slavery is forced labor. That's the definition I'm rolling with under slavery. It's forced.
Okay,
labor.
if you're using that definition, right, I will accept your definition only if, for the means of the discussion, I disagree, but I'll accept that for the means of the discussion and simply say that it is justified slavery. They have every right to be enslaved. They have no right to argue against their enslavement. They are stopped from arguing as such.
You believe that there's I disagree with that. I don't think that we just because you commit a crime you cannot be forced to be a slave. And I think my justification of that would be that the punishment for the crime is the separation of yourself from society, and that tacking on punishment to that crime is I'm going to use the word again, and we can talk about it if we want to, but it's unreasonable, I think, to tack on punishment to said crime. And I think when we look at countries that don't have this forced labor, we not only see a safer prison population, we see recidivism drop, and we see when prisoners are actually able to be paid for the work they're doing, we see them able to, when they get out of prison, contribute to society more than they did prior to going into prison.
I would say that the criminal enslaved their victim, right? And so it's a one-to-one situation. Now, we can put a monetary value to the best of our ability, especially if an individual is within a community that has some system of governance that establishes this, or the individual has a rights enforcement agency, an insurance company, et cetera, that establishes, what those values are. But there is some form, though it be subjective, there is some form of value to someone's time, right? This is the whole point of wages, right? Is that my time, my skills, my work has some level of value.
What's the definition of slavery that you're using under that framework?
I would say when one aggresses upon the bodily autonomy of another and prevents them from using scarce means towards the individual's ends, right? So it is a form of enslavement to kidnap me, but it is also a form of enslavement to, let's say, damage or steal my property that is intermingled both with my body and with my historical links and my labor. I don't want to go into homesteading per se, because I think that's a bridge too far. I would say, the historical link to property and my means, and my bodily autonomy, right? Because there is a direct link between my property and my body. Any form of aggression towards my property or my body is a form of enslavement, kidnapping, violence, etc. Right?
I would disagree with that, like, very heavily.
I'm sure, but going back, when you describe prisons, right, in other countries and things like that, you're talking about moral preferences into how you believe prisons should be reformed to be better. That has nothing to do with what is or isn't justifiable to do to an aggressor, right? If an aggressor, so let's say you murder someone, right? Let's say you murder me, right? For whatever reason, you don't like the way this debate goes. You get really mad, you pull up to my address and you shoot me and kill me, right? Now, let's say an inventor the next day comes out with a machine. And the way this machine works is if someone steps into this machine, they will die, but it will bring someone else of their choosing back to life. You cannot justifiably argue in any way, shape, or form that you not be forced to step into that machine after killing me, to bring me back to life, to restore what it was that you took from this earth with your aggression. That is the point of contention here, is that you don't get to say, well, you can't make me kill myself. That's enslavement. I have a right to bodily autonomy. You argued against your own right of bodily autonomy when you killed someone else. You have no leg to stand on.
Well, I fully disagree with that.
Why?
So when we're looking at bodily rights compared to property rights, I think they might have an inherent linking, but I think that we're looking at them in different ways. I even based off the argument you just gave, I don't see how you can consider the damage of property as a form of enslavement. Like, even given the context you just rolled it in, right? Like,
what are you missing?
Well, you're not being forced to do anything. There is no force that I'm putting on you specifically by damaging your property.
Right, but you're what force you're putting onto me is what occurred in the past, right? So if you steal something from me, right, I need to replace that in order to have all the work that I have done in my life that allowed me to have that property restored to its natural state. So you're not enslaving the present me by stealing my current property. You're enslaving the me that purchased or acquired or gained that property in some past manner, right? I was an individual that worked for money and then I bought a TV. You stole my TV, right? In order for me to replace that TV, right, you can restore that TV to its original state and pay me for my time and the harassment that you've done so that you can argue that your rights be restored, right? But no matter what, when the moment you stole that TV, you took from me the labor, the bodily autonomy that I had in the past that I exercised towards acquiring that TV. Past me has been enslaved by your actions. And when you make a moral, when you make a moral proclamation via your behavior that must be universalizable, what you have done is you've said that it is right. If you do not repay me, you do not restore it to its natural state, then you're making via your behavior, the performance that you're doing with your behavior, is you are making the statement that it is right to enslave people and to steal things from them that they have worked and to enslave their body in the past. Once that becomes universalizable, you are making the argument that it is right to do so now and it is right to do so in the future. And that means it's okay for me to enslave you up until the damages that you have done that restores me to my current to the position I had before your aggression.
Yeah, I believe that the past you doesn't exist anymore. So I don't know how I can enslave somebody that's not here anymore. Like, I understand the concepts you're saying, but like that person doesn't exist. They're not here. So how am I enslaving them when they're not here?
So you're saying that you as an individual are made up of a million deaths and who you were in the past has no link to who you are today.
I'm saying that I can't enslave somebody who doesn't exist anymore. And the you that built that is not you currently. You currently is somebody completely different.
Okay, so let's say you work really hard for something. Like let's say you're not making that much money on Twitch, right? And then I come and I steal the means of your production, if you will, right? Come and steal your computer, I steal your microphone, I steal the cat headphone ears, I even steal your gamer chair, right? How dare I? I steal all of these things, and you don't have enough money in your bank account to restore the things that were stolen, right? Well, as I've stolen those things, the past you invested time and money into where you are today. You're inexorably linked to the efforts that you put in to establish yourself now. And it's proven by the fact that you don't have the money to very quickly restore those products. And so future you is harmed by the damages done to past you because you can't stream for a month or so. You got to go get a regular job. You have to build your funds back up so that you can build the equipment back up so that you can begin streaming. And then when you come back, you're not sitting with 200 viewers. You're sitting with like 80 and like maybe you lost some time. You've lost money and your ability to make money in the present and in the future based upon the actions that I did on the work that you've done in the past. They're inexorably linked.
Wait, I understand the concept that you're saying. I disagree that it is enslavement. My question with this would be, do you hold this viewpoint for like every type of quote unquote theft, like across the board? Or is it just when it comes to people that then get placed into prison? So
what do you mean? Like, all theft
so like,
is unjustified.
Yeah. So like if I run a business that's really dangerous and I hire somebody and force them to do like really dangerous work that doesn't affect their body now, but 30 years down the road, they get like cancer because they were working around like hazardous material. Did
you tell the person about it?
I didn't know about it. They didn't know about it.
No crime has been committed.
We didn't know this material was cancerous.
No crime has been committed.
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, should I be responsible to pay for them to get treatment?
No crime has been committed.
Interesting.
Well, you said they didn't know, right? So let's say we don't know about mesothelioma and we don't know about asbestos, and we're talking about a construction company in the 1970s, right? Now, if they did know and they didn't inform the worker, then they committed fraud, right? Like they lied to the individual during their employment agreement, right? And let's say they did know, but they informed the worker and said, here's all of the fucking things that can happen to you if you do this job. Do you still want to do this job? The worker can be like, yeah, I want to do this job, but I'm doing this job for $40 an hour, not $22 an hour, right? So if you voluntarily agree to an agreement to work for another person, and through no fault of your own, you exposed that person was exposed to danger. That's just an unfortunate circumstance. It's like, do I sue the Weather Channel because they didn't accurately predict where the hurricane would land? Of course not. It's no fault of their own. They used the best information they had so that people could prepare for the landfall of a hurricane, and they were wrong. But if they lied about where the hurricane was going to hit and they actually did know where it was going to hit, all of a sudden I'm making assumptions based off of inaccurate information that is being sold to me as the truth.
Are you against workers' comp?
Am I against workers' comp? And I'm an anarchist, so I'm against all forms of wealth redistribution, et cetera, et cetera. Though I would say that workers' comp, like the state has a monopoly on like the enforcement and regulations of companies. So in some ways you get into like a weird icky area where like I hold the state in some ways responsible as like until those rights can be given back to the people as like a trustee of the rights that they have stolen. So like it gets weird. So I need more specifics to determine like where I would be on that. Because I think workers, you know what I mean? Like, because more often than not, workers' comp is paid by the companies, right? And so when you engage in a voluntary kind of employment situation with a company, workers' comp is something you think about when doing an employment negotiation. So let's say we destroyed workers' comp. You would likely ask your employer for more money, or you might ask for stronger insurance or something like that, right? Because that safety net is there and paid by the company. And so both the company and the worker are evaluating that in their decision. But like ultimately, yeah, I want the state not to be involved at all in any of these transactions.
In this idea of, let me think how I want to phrase this. In this idea of like theft of past labor and whatnot, how far does that go? Like if you're deceased and I steal something, do I then owe restitutions to like your family if you like leave something to them, or like how do you factor that in?
Yeah, I mean the definition doesn't change, right? I mean, if I steal your property but you're dead and you bequeathed it to your children, I stole from your children, not the dead person. But again, like we're getting into the nitty gritty.
Well, wait, but I think it's
hold on. No, we're getting into the nitty gritty of my definition of slavery. I think you have a pretty good understanding of it, right? You disagree with it. And I already said that I would be willing to accept the idea of justifiable slavery if we want to use your definition. If you're confused by libertarians understanding the definition of the term slavery, but I'm already willing to use your definition, I don't really think it matters that much. I'll use your definition and call it justified slavery we still haven't gotten into this idea where you think that we can use this subjective kind of amorphous idea of reasonable as a means of determining what we can and can't do to criminals in prisons, and you somehow impose this subjective moral obligation on what individuals do as victims to those that aggress upon them through the prison system. Like that's the actual conversation here, not you trying to understand libertarians' definition of slavery. Like, I'm already willing to use your definition.
But wait, we're talking about whether or not we believe that this slavery should be justified. You're saying it is based on this. So I'm getting down into the nitty gritty of that, because we're now trying to understand, is this a justifiable form of slavery? So I want to know if your concept
I've gone pretty
holds firm.
Yeah, I mean, we can go backwards, and we can go into AE, and then we can go into Aristotelian logic, and then we can go into existence exists versus the primacy of consciousness, so that we can establish all of logic in its existence. But like, it doesn't change the fact that you're still standing on reasonable as a subjective community definition. And I'm saying, well, there's conflict in the definition of reasonable, and you refuse to ground anything.
Wait, but we're not on that anymore, right? Now we're talking about whether or not slavery is justified.
You've pivoted to questioning the idea, my libertarian definitions, and we're going down a rabbit hole of the definition when I already said I accept your definition. We can go down this rabbit hole so long as you'll just take the L on the fact that you have no ground.
Wait, no. There is no taking the L here. When we first of all, you've talked way more than I have. So like, anytime I give a point, we move.
Yeah, because you're questioning me. And I'm just saying, like,
without the question,
you remain unquestioned.
Hold on, no. You've stated that you will go under my assumption. We can talk about whether or not slavery is justified or not justified, right? Under this assumption of is it slavery in prison? If it is slavery in prison, is it justified? Is it not justified? So if we're arguing under that framework, whether it is justified or not justified, you've said that because you're stealing from your past bodily autonomy, that it is now a justified form of slavery to pay restitutions for that. So I'm now trying to see how that logic holds.
All right, let me get a positive statement, because we pivoted away from the Dr. Walter Block's example of the machine, right? Where you would be unjustified in stepping into the machine, killing yourself in order to resurrect me from life if you had killed me. And you said, I don't believe that. And then you went on to another line of questioning. So let me get a positive statement on you, because you keep saying it's unjustified, like that my definitions don't make sense, but then you're just going further down the rabbit hole of my definitions. Why do you not believe that it is reasonable, right, if you will, to make someone who is a murderer, who kills a person, step into a machine to restore that person to life, giving up their own life? Why is that unjustified?
So the way I was getting into that was by looking at your framework and showing that if this doesn't hold 100% of the time, I don't believe we can hold it to this moral extreme. If it doesn't hold all the time,
that's not an answer. That's not an answer. That's saying I'm going to continue down your line of logic until I feel like I can subvert your line of logic. That's not a positive position, that backing up why you believe it is not right for you to do that. You just give a simple answer as to why a criminal that murders someone not be forced to step into a machine that brings that person back to life at the cost of their own life. Why?
Yeah, I believe all humans have a right to life, and I don't believe that right to life can ever be taken, even if you take another person's life.
So that's your axiom. Where are you establishing that axiom?
I believe it's the only way to exist that causes the least amount of harm. Even if somebody has already killed somebody, I believe it would cause more harm to then kill them.
So you're establishing the axiom that bodily autonomy is right. I'm sorry, what?
I said the right to life.
Okay, so the right to life.
We all have a right to life.
So you have a right to life. Underneath the right to life is bodily autonomy. You believe that there is some amorphous, subjective kind of definition of reasonable that we all understand, but we can't quite define, that allows bodily autonomy to be overridden, but not the right to life. You
Correct.
Ground the right to life in a consequential analysis of harm reduction, right? You believe
the only time you can remove someone's right to life is if they are actively removing yours. That's the only
right.
time.
But you ground that idea in harm reduction. That was your words, not mine, right? How are you grounding your ability to predict the future, i.e. this idea of harm reduction. Because the logic seems circular to me. You're using an opinion, stating it's an axiom, and then grounding it with consequentialism. How are you grounding your consequentialism?
Yeah, do you believe killing causes harm?
Do I believe that killing causes harm?
Correct.
It depends on how you define harm, because it depends on what you mean by harm and whether or not killing an aggressor, for example, is constituted by harm. Depends upon your definition. If you mean like give me your definition of harm, and then we can move from whether or not I answer.
Causing anyone pain or suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So then I believe that if we kill somebody, when they are not actively killing another person, we are causing somebody pain and suffering. And that is adding harm. Okay. And I don't want to add harm if we don't need to add harm.
But isn't not wanting to add harm just like histrionics? This is not grounded in anything. Like, why is harm bad? Harm can be good. Just ask any Buddhist, right? Life is suffering. Like, it's a meaningful part of our existence. Working hard to achieve things, like the idea of sacrifice comes from present harm, right? So that we can have a better foreseeable outcome in the future. That is where sacrifice comes from. Harm can be good. Why is overall harm reduction a morally superior situation?
So I disagree that harm is good. I really do. I disagree that harm is good. I think you can have this idea that, like, oh, well, if I suffer now, I might gain something in the future, but there's no guarantee of that gain in the future. That's
so you think hard work is definitionally morally bad?
When did I say that? I don't think hard work is always harm. I think some people work hard and they like it, so they're not being harmed. They're not suffering.
Right, but
they like their hard work. I believe
so now we're
probably bad.
So now we're not talking about physical pain, right? Physical pain is not a meaningful metric. What you're talking about is happiness.
And suffering. I said pain and suffering. I think suffering can be emotionally or physically.
If you ask any gym bro, like, they'll say they suffered for the body that they prefer, right? That they went through pain and suffering, and they did so on purpose to get a morally desired outcome, right?
Yeah,
so I don't understand what you're grounding this in.
That was consensual. They did that themselves.
So you can't be harmed by things that you consent to? Have you ever heard of BDSM?
No, but unconsensual harm is bad harm. I don't think there's an issue with consensual harm.
It's nature. So is nature evil? Like the law, this grounding is silly. Like, nature's not evil. Like, is a hurricane evil? Is it morally wrong?
I don't know what we're talking about. Nature.
Because nature harms without consent and causes people to go through pain and suffering, and is the condition of man.
I thought it was pretty clear that we were talking about, like, people. Like, the example that we used here is whether someone gives up their life or is killed because they killed somebody else.
Yeah, but the logic.
Framework.
Well, no, that's just the logic isn't consistent once we add other elements that do exist.
I don't think my logic has to be consistent from humans to, like, weather. I think that logic doesn't have to be consistent in that way. I think if we're talking about, like, how sentient beings engage with themselves, I think to go, but does this hold with a hurricane, is a little disingenuous.
Okay, so what you're saying is harm is defined as one individual actor causing pain and suffering to another person without their consent. That's how and that it is an overall moral preference, moral good, to reduce non-consensually imposed pain and suffering to an individual, and that is what you base your that is the moral preference that you base your position as an axiom towards life. I'm not really sure I'm seeing that connection, and hopefully I'm not missing something, but I feel like I have all of the principal elements here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that when we look at human beings, we are inherently sentient and social creatures. I think that harm, and if I'm restating what you say, that's fine. I just want to state it so that while it's fresh in my head.
No, I want to make it clear.
I believe that any consensual harm is consensual. So I don't have an issue with you consenting to doing something. So if you're like a sadomasochist and you like whipping yourself in the back, you're agreeing to that. So as long as you agree to it, that's fine. I think if you are being harmed and you do not agree to being harmed, then that's a violation of your especially if it's killing, it's a violation of your right to life, and it's a violation of your bodily autonomy if you do not agree to it. Now we can look at what
but hold on, the logic is still circular. You haven't affirmed your axiom of a right to life.
I disagree.
You can't just say I disagree. You just use the right to life in your explanation of harm, and you're not connected. I said, what backs up this axiom that all people have a right to life that cannot be trammeled no matter what, regardless of their actions or their behavior, right? And we're in this arena now of understanding how you define harm and the consequentialist analysis of philosophy of harm reduction, right?
Yeah, I just believe we have universal human rights based on the fact that we're sentient creatures, and that we need to have these universal human rights to work as social contracts in order to actually live in a society amongst each other. And once we start removing those social contracts, the society starts to basically collapse.
I don't know what a social contract is by your definition. I think social contract's hilarious because I never signed one. I didn't agree to some form of harm be done to me, right? Which is what the state does. And that's what the aggressor does, right? I have a negative right from harm, right? It's, that's what the aggressor does. This is why we're dealing with a criminal, right? But I don't understand what you're saying. You're saying, I believe we have a right to life because we're sentient creatures. Consciousness gives us a right to life. Are you a vegan? I'm just curious.
No, but I'm also a speciesist.
Okay, right. So I mean, like, as a libertarian, just to make this easy for you, right? As a libertarian, I would, we ground things in argumentation ethics, right? The ability to, what is a moral actor? What is a moral agent? I think the species human and those even that don't fit those categories via Bayesian inference, are in, kind of speciesism, like you were saying, are in the category of individuals that are capable of being moral actors, making valid moral propositional statements. So I agree with you there. So persons, right? Like you would say, because we are persons, because we are moral actors, moral agents in some regard, we have a right to life. But I asked you to ground that, and you grounded it in harm reduction, which required your understanding of a right to life. That's the circular logic here. You haven't grounded the right to life.
Yeah, so
especially
then
one that's untrammeled.
Sure, maybe you can give me like a better can you give me some of the inherent rights or do you believe in inherent human rights?
Yeah, I'm a libertarian.
Okay, what inherent human rights do you think exist?
Bodily autonomy. From that a lot of other rights are derived, and we kind of like group them and we talk about them colloquially, but it's all one right, the right to bodily autonomy.
Great. And what do you think gives us that right to bodily autonomy?
Well, we're moral agents, we're moral actors, and it is impossible for an individual to logically argue against the right of bodily autonomy. Doing so puts one in a performative contradiction, and therefore it either must be false or it must be a performance of gobbledygook. So when we engage in argumentation, one can argue that one have a right to bodily autonomy, but one cannot logically argue that they not have a right to bodily autonomy. This is assuming that we believe in Aristotelian logic, which I think most people will affirm. I don't know that I need to ground the law of identity, excluded middle, and non-contradiction. But Habermas's performative contradiction flows from the law of non-contradiction by creating P and not P in our behaviors or in the unstated things of our acts. And when we engage in argumentation and we recognize the bodily autonomy of the other person by doing so in all pursuits of truth, in argumentation. Now, if we fight, we are not engaged in that. If we ingress, we are not engaged in that. But that person is then unable, they are stopped from being able to argue for their own right to bodily autonomy.
So wait, just so that I'm aware, the basis of the claim is that bodily autonomy is a human right because no one's able to argue against it.
Basically, yeah. No one's able to logically argue against it. Or if you use the appropriate definition of argumentation, yes, they're not able to argue against it.
How is that a grounding, though?
Well, I said it's grounded in Aristotelian logic, right? So do you want me to ground like the law of identity, that like this is a cup, and that like when I say this cup exists, my eyes are able to see this cup? Like how far back do we go, right?
Well, I just view it kind of weird that like, you know, my grounding has to be it's grounded in this, but your grounding can be it's grounded because no one's argued against it yet.
No, I grounded it, and I told you the name in which it grounded in. Your grounding was self-referential and circular logic, right? I said it's grounded in existence exists, right? And from that we gain the law of identity, the law of excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction, moving into Habermas's law of the performative contradiction, right? Then we would go into an praxeology in the idea, which I did in my opening statement, right? The idea that all humans are rational actors, even if they're have missing information. And then we would establish conflict as when two individuals want to use the same resource for opposing means, right? And we establish conflict by an understanding that one individual has a right to that property and another individual does not, right? How do we establish that from a historical link? Or, you know, that gets a little bit murky. I don't think anyone has perfectly described the establishment of that. I think embordering an historical link is kind of the best way. And then we move into argumentation ethics and the inability of one to argue for aggression, argue for, let's say, taxation, or that it is right to kill someone that has done no wrong, et cetera, without engaging in a performative contradiction.
Yeah, it just, again, it feels like you're grounding it in a lot of like philosophical, I don't want to say jargon, but it feels like you're grounding it in a lot of like philosophical theory, but like what makes those philosophical theories correct?
Well, like I said, you have to start from existence exists versus the primacy of consciousness. If you want to accept the primacy of consciousness, then, you know, you could still arrive at the same conclusion if you are a Christian, for example, right? And you believe that logic is handed to you by God. But if you refuse to affirm Aristotelian formal logic and you're instead going into the lens of like paraconsistent logic, like I feel like the entire debate is kind of over at that point because you deny logic. And if you're denying formal logic, like we're kind of already in a place where like I can kind of just claim victory because all of your statements are not based in any form of logic, right? So I don't know what system you're using to make the gobbledygook words you're using, but I would assume that you want your arguments to be logically valid and sound. I mean, I know philosophy is like a lot, right? And like when talking about privatized prison and policing, that's not necessarily where we want the conversation to go. But I can assure you that my grounding is grounded and that I have a name for it, an argument for it that isn't self-referential, right? You, however, have presented a self-referential argument.
I think your end goal in your grounding is that existence exists. Is that not circular?
No, it's not, right? Like existence exists is the concept that in order for consciousness, which is kind of hilariously enough your grounding a little bit, or at least it appears to be, which is the idea that we have rights because we are sentient creatures, right? A sentient creature exists. And the statement that existence exists is saying that the material world is the material world. That if there is a God, for example, right, in order for God to affect our lives, he must affect the material world, which means there must be some material existence of God, at least some link, some way to get to God's kind of plane of existence, if you will, right? That to affirm existence exists is to say that there is an existence, that what we are experiencing is something. It is no longer a denial of reality itself, which is to say, if reality exists, then it exists, right? Like if there is a reality, right? Now, the only argument against existence exists are twofold. The primacy of consciousness, which I dismiss with, and then there is the idea that reality doesn't exist and therefore nothing matters. If you want to go against existence exists, right, you must either say that there is a creator figure and that the world really has no meaning, it only matters in the eyes of this amorphous God, or you must say the reality doesn't exist. And so both of those positions kind of put you in the place where like your arguments for or against something are meaningless, because, and the reason they're meaningless is because none of this matters because it doesn't exist.
Let me think on that for a second, because okay. So at the end point of it all, now here's the thing: I mostly debate policy, right? So this is I'm dusting off philosophical parts of my brain that I don't use, because I usually only debate policy stuff.
Yo, look, I was willing to use your definition of slavery.
Well, my issue was
just saying
you didn't let me dive further into yours, right? Like I don't want to just use mine because we think it's right.
Because we're going here. That's why, right? I was like, look, I'll use your definition of slavery. We could just talk about the principle of estoppel. But if you want to go to the grounding of all logic, like that's what you're going to have to do if you keep going down this rabbit hole.
Well, I disagree. I think we got into a point where it was let me see if I can even try to remember. It was like 30 minutes ago.
We can always go back to the Walter Block example as to why you think it's wrong.
Well, wait, no. What I wanted to dive into was, if you steal from someone, you are harming their past self. You are stealing from their past self. You are causing slavery to their past self because they put in
and their present self and their future self. Yeah, sure.
And that because of that, they can seek restitution from you by forcing labor out of you.
Yeah. Well, they can seek restitution from you and repayment so long as it doesn't exceed the crime that they committed, right? So like if I steal an apple, I can't kidnap you for a year, right? Because
if that
punishment doesn't fit.
Sure. If I steal, like, let's say you have a Ferrari and I steal your Ferrari and I crash after I've stolen it, I crash and I die. Who are you now going to get restitution from? Who does that fall on?
Well, I mean, no one, right? Like, that's just an unfortunate circumstance. They didn't pass on property. I mean, like, depending upon, so like, there would be some in libertarianism that would argue that because, and I'm pretty sympathetic to this. I don't know if I buy it 100%, because I haven't worked it out, but many would say if you have an estate, right? And that estate, that estate can be taxed, right? So like, and I would kind of agree to that, right? So let's say you have a mansion and you steal a Ferrari, right? Then you crash the Ferrari and die. You know, when your mansion is bequeathed to your children, you don't actually have a right to all of your property because you have stolen from other people, and those people are owed a portion of that Ferrari. So when the mansion is given to the children either need to sell the mansion, right, or pay me my restitution, etc., because they didn't have a right to all of the property that was bequeathed to them. But let's say you own no property, right? It doesn't fall on the children that have not received any property from you to pay on your behalf because this debt exists, right? Because the debt doesn't pass on to the children. The debt only passes on to the individual and the property that is historically linked to them, right? So it really, the answer is like, does that person that stole the Ferrari own property?
So, confirming, if you steal from somebody and you are financially have property, when you pass that property down, you should have to pay for the restitution of the thing that was stolen. Just to make sure that I understand. Okay.
Yeah. Like I leave a house to my kids.
How many times passed down does that work?
Forever.
Like if
that is just the objective fact.
Okay. So
you have to prove it, obviously.
Yeah, sure. So under this framework, and I promise I'm going with something where it's not meant for a gotcha or anything. Under this framework, you would believe it as well in like reparations and stuff for like slavery, World War II, whatever the thing is, as long as we can directly link one family's wealth to it in another family.
Yeah. So it needs to be like established fully so that you can directly link it. So like, for example, with like land back and restitution in America, the only one that I can like really prove is probably the Cherokee Nation in northern Georgia, right? Because they clearly homesteaded the property. They built homes. They put up a post office. They went to the Supreme Court. They were denied from the Supreme Court. They went back to the Supreme Court once they had American citizens in that post office. The Supreme Court argued in their favor. And then President Andrew Jackson told the Cherokee Nation, fuck you, walk the Trail of Tears. And he told SCOTUS at the time, send in your marshals, right? Like, we can pretty clearly track those people for the most part, right? That have direct lineage, that land in Georgia is owed to those people. And the people that are currently living in that land are on stolen property. And the way that works is that every piece of property accrued up until that point was fraudulent, right? It was a fraudulent sale. Now, obviously, it is not the current homeowner that is responsible for returning their current home to the Cherokee Nation. Technically it is, but it is also the state's responsibility to pay all of those that have been defrauded in this process. Unfortunately, the state doesn't own money. The only thing it has is stolen tax money. And so there is an unfortunate circumstance of how do we return when so much has been squandered and stolen by the state and kind of just doesn't exist anymore. You know what I mean? Like the best we can hope for in many of these circumstances is a dissolution of the state and the return of property to the best available means and prosecution of all criminals that worked towards that theft. But yeah, sure. Restitution goes back forever.
Yeah, and do you believe that like labor, like I said, these questions I'm genuinely interested in your takes on these. Do you believe that labor is paramount to capital, or I guess, or property? So like we're saying that if you own a lot of property and you steal from somebody and you die, your children should give a portion of that estate, but that doesn't count towards, like, they shouldn't have to give their labor. That your children shouldn't have to give their labor. You can't get back, only if there is.
You can't own labor. Labor is not a thing you can own. It's impossible to own labor. There's no labor tree that you can pick labor fruit from, right? When an individual engages in a voluntary transaction, what they are doing is they're signing a contract on the title of transfer of commodities. And the stipulations in the contract say that if you want me to give you these commodities, you must do certain things for me. You're not selling your labor. What you're doing is you're developing a contract that says, I want this much money per hour. You agree to pay me this much money per hour, so long as I agree to these portions of the contract. So labor is not property. You don't own labor. So yeah, like that's why I would treat labor differently than actual property, especially when talking about like passing things down.
How would we have bodily autonomy then, if we can't own our labor?
We go all the way back in that conversation about argumentation ethics and stuff like that, right? Like we have a right to our body, right? Some libertarians, you'll say, you'll hear the term self-ownership. It's really more of like a colloquial saying than like proper ownership, because I don't think you can sell yourself into slavery. That being said, I guess I don't understand the question, because I don't substantiate bodily autonomy with the ownership of labor. Like it'd be the Marxian analysis that would do that, right? Like that man has the right to the fruits of his labor. Like it would be working in a different direction. I'm not working from that direction. That's not how I'm establishing bodily autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just an unnecessary element.
Okay, interesting. I'm just wondering. Let me see where I want to go.
You went from debating an ANCAP on prisons to just learning about ANCAP. I'm cool with it. You know what I mean? Like, welcome to the interview, boys on Twitch. Like, this is fun.
Well, again, because we got into this whole weeds of what is slavery. Personally, when I argue slavery in prisons, I go based off the fact that like legally and constitutionally it is slavery. Like we specifically wrote our 13th Amendment.
Yeah, but you don't give a fuck about the Constitution.
Oh, yeah.
Come on. You want to get rid of the state. You said earlier you want to get rid of the state. Why is the Constitution not just a piece of fucking paper? You're only using the Constitution as a tool to argue against conservatives that believe it to be a sacred founding document from Enlightenment principles. You don't give a fuck about that piece of paper, and neither do I. Don't bullshit me.
Well, wait. But if I'm arguing about a system that is run under the Constitution, I'm going to argue what the Constitution says.
Yeah, it's a rhetorical device because you know that the other person cares about it. But let's not kid ourselves.
No, it's not.
Neither of us give a fuck about that piece of
paper. It's
paper.
not that I know what cares about him. It's that this thing is what legally in the current system that we're in gives the state the right to enslave people.
Right, but you don't give a fuck about it, right? Like ultimately, the only reason you care about it is because other people care about it as a rhetorical position or as like where their principles are, so that you can utilize that document as a means of making a legal argument as why their own system that they have set up differentiates or substantiates some position that you have, right? Like, but ultimately, if you're an anarchist or you're ready to destroy the state, right? Like, why do you care so much about that document as anything other than a tool for rhetoric? Like, come on, you can be honest with me, right? Like, we're both anarchists here. You don't care. It's just it's just a debate.
No, I disagree with that slightly. Like I said, I think when I'm arguing under the current system, that's what I use, right? I don't have the ability, as much as I'd love to see it, to remove the state. So I want to argue with under the state that I'm in, how can I change that? If we want to argue like our like my communistic stuff, then yeah, fuck the state, fuck the Constitution, get rid of all of it.
There you go. A little bit of honesty. Come on, but you can be honest with me. We've developed enough repertoire.
I don't think I was being dishonest in that. I think I was saying this.
I'm just saying you care about it as a tool in the current system, as a means to an end, and your end is to have the beliefs that you actually have presented, and the Constitution is simply a means, a rhetorical tool or device in which for you to reach that goal, both in debate and within our current structure, because that is where the power lies. At least from a critical theorist position, right? Like the power dynamics put the Constitution as a document that you feel that you must appeal to as a means of working within the power dynamic. Come
on. Give me a second. Let me think on that.
Don't help him, chat. I'm not seeing his chat, but I know what these pauses mean. Streamer's trying to get some arguments from chat. I see you.
No.
I see you, Jovan.
No, I do this. I do
teasing.
this all. I like to. I take a little bit to think. Right. I take a little bit. So I guess our overall contention is that I view it as slavery. You don't view it as slavery.
See, the problem, are you aware of the principle of estoppel in common law?
Well, so here's the thing. If it's anything philosophy related, no.
Was common law thing. Sure, it's philosophical in some degree, but it's common law, right? I can explain it to you pretty simply, right? So the estoppel principle basically says that one is incapable of making an argument in court, right? So let's say, for example, you are charged with a DUI, right? And you're convicted of a DUI and your sentence is put out, right? And let's say you commit a second DUI 2 years later. You're stopped from arguing, well, I've never committed a DUI before, because your actions in a court of law have shown that you have indeed been convicted previously of a DUI. Like you may say that you may claim some innocence on that, but the record shows that at the very least you were convicted in a court of law of this, right? So the principle of estoppel here is that one has to argue for their human rights, and one is incapable of arguing for their human rights when their behavior is arguing against it. This is really the crux of the contradiction that affords the right of self-defense, right? When you say, well, people have a right of life unless they're actively in a pursuit of violence, right? You recognize that there is a threat to your own life. But see, what's really occurring is that they're arguing via their actions that they don't give a fuck about your right to life, and therefore they don't have a right to life, right? That is what's really occurring. And so the idea behind a system of justice to restore things to a normal point is that we simply take that argument as a fact, and we recognize that argument isn't just in the present. When someone breaks into my home and threatens to murder me, or like, let's say, kills my wife, right? Their actions have stopped them from arguing that they not be treated in the same way. that doesn't mean that our moral preferences as a society, as a collective, can look at that and go, just because I have a right to imprison that person because they have no right, they have no negative rights for me because their own actions have argued that they don't give a fuck about your right to life, doesn't mean that I shouldn't set up my society to have, let's say, restorative justice. Let's say to have prison systems that are all about mental health and therapy. It doesn't mean that your society can't create some system that is based upon your preferences that you believe leads to the outcomes that you want. The problem is that you can't use force. You can't grab your guns and go to the neighboring community that locks that person in prison and forces them to break big rocks into little rocks until they pay off their debt. But you should argue that shitty place has a better prison system and prove to them that yours works better with less crime and happier people and have the kumbaya world that we all want.
I mean, I think that is pretty provable. Okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. Like, I don't want people turning big rocks.
Sure. When we're looking at this idea of like forced labor in prison, I want to kind of touch back on, because I feel like we didn't go down it enough. This idea of like taking the gamble. How solid are you on that? Like, we have to take the gamble on that.
Every single action that you take is a gamble based upon whether or not you're aggressing upon another person. Every single action. If you go to the store and you buy some fruit, you're assuming that the fruit isn't stolen, right? You're assuming when you go to the pawn shop, maybe you have a little bit less of a good assumption when you buy the speaker equipment from the pawn shop, right? That this isn't stolen property, right? But you assume that the state has documentation and records that this isn't stolen property. And it's a good deal. So you buy it. Every action that you do, when you walk, you assume you're not on someone else's property. Every action that you do is an assumption based off of all of the information that you have available that you're doing what it is that you want to do and that it achieves the goals that you want.
But wait, if we're looking at the idea of forcing somebody into labor, even if they haven't committed the crime, I would argue that type of gamble is a lot deeper than,
yes,
did I buy an apple?
Yes,
that might have been
which
stolen.
Is right, which is why right. But if I buy a stolen speaker equipment, right, the gamble there is that I was defrauded, right, and so I'm going to have to return the speaker equipment, and then I'm later going to have to find some means of recouping the money, the commodities that was defrauded from me, from the pawn shop person, right? That's the gamble, is that I may be in possession of stolen property. I assume it not to be stolen, but if it is, I have to give this stolen property back to the rightful owner, and then I have to seek restitution from the person that defrauded. Now, the gamble when you lock someone in jail is I may be forced to pay back years of someone's life. That is an incredibly expensive thing to pay back, right? What is that value? What are the prior agreements to that value? And and you might even say, well, you can't measure, human life and things like that. And while this is true, the same is true for property, right? It's impossible to measure the value of this cell phone, right? Because while this cell phone has a market value, that is just a supply and demand equation based off of the average price people are willing to pay and the average price that a corporation is willing to sell this phone for. But to me, this may be a phone that is incredibly valuable to me, right? Maybe this phone is the only place I have stored all of the fucking videos I took fucking my ex, and it's like my greatest spank bank ever. And like, if I lose this phone, I lose all of the spank bank material, right? And so it's worth more than the actual value of the phone because subjectively it's worth more to me, right? So all of this is subjective. You come to prior arrangements, you attempt to come to conclusions through arbitration. The fact of the matter is that there is an objective fact in the universe and via logic, but that doesn't mean that we're able to necessarily ascertain that fact. We make a gamble off of that fact with all of our actions, be they whether we aggress upon someone knowingly or unknowingly, whether we steal from someone, or whether or not, how we pay for things and all of the actions that we take.
Okay. I'll be honest. Me and philosophy don't do well together. So most of this conversation, I've just been like, okay, that's why it's mostly been me asking questions. I don't do philosophy stuff.
Look, I'm okay with that, man. Like, I have no problem with a debate stream turning into a philosophical discussion. I can go either way. I love both of them. I love shitting on commies and fucking them up and making their brains go question mark, exclamation mark, Pikachu face. And at the same time, I love, audiences being exposed to ideas that I'm extremely passionate about. And you have a fairly large audience, so I'm not going to be mad about it, right?
Sure. I'd say if you're interested in this conversation, like from a more philosophical level, I have friends who are better at that than I am.
I've debated a lot of
much better. I don't think these are mostly TikTokers. You probably haven't.
Oh, maybe not. Yeah, most of the people I've debated have been like YouTubers for the.
Yeah, these. I just think from in terms of my viewpoints, it hasn't really changed where I'm at, which is, like I said, do the least amount of harm to the least amount of people, which is fine. I just know that I only usually have about an hour and a half in me before my brain starts perplexing.
That's fine. Look, I'll summarize the point like this. People have a right to bodily autonomy, and that right is derived from their ability to, from existence exists, Aristotelian logic, into the performative contradiction, right? From Habermas, who was able to prove that the postmodernists were absolutely wrong when they said that there was no objective truth, because on one hand, they were saying there's no objective truth, but their statement was an admission that they believed that statement was an objective truth. The two contradict, P and not P. P equals not P is not a valid thing. The same is true when engaged in general argumentation. And what you are establishing is a discovery, trying to obtain truth from the other individual and recognizing that person has bodily autonomy. We move into conflict. And that conflict is established when two individuals want to use scarce means towards the same end. Then we must establish that someone has a right to use that resource and another doesn't. From the very beginning of anarchism, people like Benjamin Tucker, Lysander Spooner, Josiah Warren, and even Proudhon, to a certain extent, were recognizing the problems inherent to the idea of personal property, though obviously Proudhon still stuck to it as a market anarchist. But, property is theft, property is liberty, but he said both of those things, right? So it's kind of confusing. So moving into that space, we look at, well, when does a person lose those rights? We recognize that there's, both of us recognize that there is a right to bodily autonomy. But my opponent, Jovan, says, well, there's a reasonable understanding that certain actions be taken to deprive people of their right to bodily autonomy that we've kind of collectively agreed to. I simply dismiss this, that if it's not objective, it's just a subjective preference that you force upon a greater society, then that is no different than the mob forcing on another person. It is no different than saying 9 out of 10 people agree that gang rape is awesome. Yeah, 9 out of 10 people do agree, but one person says, I don't like gang rape. You know why? Because they're the person getting raped. And so this idea of reasonable as a subjective community is not reason enough to be able to say that we may or may not use violence in some regard. It needs to be grounded, and grounded through the libertarian ethos. It is justifiable to demand that someone pay restitution and retribution for crimes that they commit, and no more. However, I do absolutely love the lefties that are concerned with mental health. I went to grad school for counseling. My undergrad is a double major in psych soc. Like I'm not aware of so many of the issues with our current policing system. I think it's atrocious, the monopoly that the state has and the way that so many people are treated under this system. From both the horrible constitutional perspective, the theft that is used to support these prisons, the war on drugs that is essentially for profit. All of these things, I agree. I really do. And I agree that in my ideal system, in my utopic anarcho-capitalism and Capistan, right? I don't want prisons forcing people to turn big rocks into little rocks. I do think that there are superior models that are shown in Norway and Sweden, where individuals are given some sense of humanity, where we use things like equine therapy and have prisoners take care of horses so that they can learn self-control as a means of being able to better regulate themselves. These are all greatly preferred things. The problem is that the state doesn't want to do it. And the reason the state doesn't want to do it is because there's a monopoly. And that monopoly allows them to steal your tax money so that they can lock more black people in prison, so that the prisons can be more full, so that the system that they want is maintained and communities of low socioeconomic status can be destroyed. But with a market system, a voluntary system, they are incentivized to have the most efficacious means of being able to reform society, reduce crime. And that is why the most efficacious system that is available is fully privatized prisons, fully privatized police forces, working in a market economy that is voluntaristic and individuals protecting their persons and property, and it is the only justified system. That would be my closing statement. I'm not reading that from anywhere. I'm just, that's my argument. Take it away, Jovan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really got nothing. Sure, I'll try to give a close. I don't disagree with some of the stuff you said. I think it's very clear that the government is forcing communities of low economic status to into a position of forced labor in order for them to make a profit off of these low income communities. I disagree that anarcho-capitalism is the solution. But again, I predominantly debate policy, not like philosophy or like I barely debate economic stuff. But I just believe that when it comes to prison, I think we have plenty of models such as like the Norwegian model or other Scandinavian models that show that like a force of labor without proper pay doesn't actually lead to what I'm looking for in a prison system, which is reduced violence for both inmates and guards, reduced recidivism, and the ability for prisoners when they get out of prison to reintegrate back into society. I see from the prison systems that we currently have that's just it's not happening. So yeah, that's
fair enough. Fair enough. That's your closing. So I won't attack your closing in any way, shape, or form, because that would be incredibly rude and inappropriate. I'll simply say if there are some people that you feel are equipped for a different form of conversation that are TikTokers I haven't heard about, because I'm not on TikTok, we don't fuck around putting all that shit on my phone. All right. I know it's all being sold by Google anyways, but I mean, give me the fantasy, right? Give me the fantasy of some level of privacy. If you want to link me up with those people, shoot me a DM. I'd love to debate more people or talk with more people. I'm more than happy to have these discussions. And I appreciate your time and I appreciate your energy. I know that those are valuable commodities that you do not own. Okay. But those are valuable nonetheless. And I appreciate it. And to everyone on Jovan's audience, you can find me on Rumble Rumble's currently working on it because apparently my channel's not searchable, Fabian Liberty Live. But if you go to my Twitch or you go to my YouTube, you'll find direct links there. You can go to Twitter as well, Liberty_Fabian. So just search Fabian Liberty in all the major places and you'll find my Rumble as well. And stuff gets uploaded to YouTube unless it's like COVID related or something. Obviously I don't put it on YouTube because I like my channel.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, man. If you stick around to my server, I'm sure I can get somebody who knows a little bit more about the philosophy to debate you. But yeah, thanks for chatting and everything.
All right, you have a great day or a great evening, I guess, if you're in the US.
You too.
All right.